"I never loved you," he said, and the rain didn't even try to hide how hard my hands were shaking. It came out of nowhere, clean and cold, like a sentence already decided long before this moment, and I stood there in heels I couldn't afford, soaked through to the skin, staring at a man who could buy the entire city and still look bored doing it. Victor Hale, 65, untouchable, unreadable, the kind of man people lowered their voices around without knowing why, and somehow the only person who had ever made me feel seen. I remember the way the streetlight caught the silver in his hair, the way his coat didn't move in the wind, like even the weather knew better than to challenge him, and I kept waiting for something, anything, a flicker, a hesitation, a crack in that perfect control, but there was nothing, just those steady eyes that had once followed me across a crowded room like I was the only thing that mattered and now looked straight through me like I was already gone. I should have said something, should have defended myself, should have asked him why, but the truth is my throat closed up the second he said it, because a part of me had always known this was how it would end, not with shouting, not with chaos, but with something quiet and final that left no room to argue, and that was the worst part, not the words themselves, but how easily he carried them, like they weighed nothing at all. I nodded instead, just once, like I understood, like I accepted it, even though my chest felt like it was folding in on itself, and I turned before he could see the moment it broke, before he could see how much power he still had without even trying. The sidewalk blurred under my feet as I walked, each step slower than the last, like my body hadn't caught up to what just happened, like it was still standing back there waiting for him to take it back, to say my name the way he used to, low and certain, like it belonged to him, but he didn't call me back, not once, and that silence followed me all the way down the block, louder than anything he could have said. By the time I reached the corner, I realized something that made me stop cold, something small and terrifying and impossible to ignore, my hand instinctively moving to my stomach like it already knew before my mind could catch up, because I hadn't told him, I hadn't told anyone, not about the missed days, not about the quiet suspicion that had been growing in the back of my mind, not about the possibility that what we had, whatever it was, hadn't ended with his words, and I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, shaky and uneven. Because suddenly this wasn't just about me walking away, this wasn't just about pride or heartbreak or whatever name you give to something that hurts this much, this was bigger, heavier, something that tied me to him in a way he couldn't erase with a single sentence, even if he thought he already had, and I pressed my palm a little firmer against my stomach, barely there, barely real, but enough to change everything, enough to make one thing painfully clear, he thought he had ended our story that night, but he had no idea it had already begun again in a way he could never control. I did not go home that night, not to the apartment that still smelled like his cologne and quiet control, not to the bed that felt too large without his presence somewhere in the shadows. I just kept walking until the city blurred into something unfamiliar, until the lights looked colder and the streets felt like they belonged to someone else, and somewhere between one block and the next I realized I had no plan, no destination, just distance, like putting miles between us could somehow make. His words echo less in my head, but they did not, they stayed, sharp and steady, repeating with every step, until I finally stopped under a flickering diner sign that buzzed like it was struggling to stay alive, and for a second I just stood there staring at my reflection in the glass, trying to recognize the girl looking back at me, trying to find the version of myself that had walked into his world thinking she could survive it unchanged. I pushed the door open and the bell chimed too loudly, drawing a glance from the waitress behind the counter, the kind of place where nobody asked questions as long as you paid your bill, and that was exactly what I needed: silence, space, a place where his name meant nothing and his power reached no further than memory, and I slid into a booth by the window, my clothes still damp, my hands still trembling just enough that I had to press them flat against the table to steady them, and when the waitress asked if I wanted coffee I nodded before she even finished the question, because I needed something warm, something real, something that did not disappear the moment he decided it should. The mug sat in front of me, steam rising in thin curls, and I wrapped my fingers around it like it could anchor me, like it could keep me from drifting back to him, and for a few minutes I just breathed, slow and careful, counting each inhale like it mattered, until the noise in my head softened just enough for one thought to rise above the rest, clear and impossible to ignore: you cannot go back. And it was not fear that made that thought settle in my chest, it was certainty, the kind that Does not leave room for doubt, because going back would mean accepting that version of myself again, the one who waited for his approval, the one who believed his silence meant safety, and I could not be her anymore, not now, not with this quiet, fragile possibility growing inside me that depended on something stronger than hope. I reached into my bag with shaking fingers and pulled out my phone, staring at the screen like it might tell me what to do next, but there were no messages, no missed calls, nothing from him, and that should have hurt more than it did, but instead it felt like confirmation, like proof that he meant every word he said, and that made the decision easier, not painless, never painless, but clear, and clarity was something I could hold on to. I searched for the nearest clinic, my thumb hovering for a second before I pressed the address, and even that small action felt like crossing a line I could never uncross, like choosing a future that did not include him in any way he could control, and as I stood up, leaving a few crumpled bills on the table, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a different way, not fear, not exactly, something steadier, quieter. He might have the power to erase me from his life, to rewrite our story in whatever way suited him, but this one truth, was mine, and he did not even know it existed. I did not remember the drive to the clinic, only the way the streetlight stretched into long streaks across my windshield and the quiet hum of the engine that felt louder than my own thoughts, like the world had narrowed down to motion and nothing else, and when I finally pulled into the parking lot it was still dark, the kind of early morning where everything feels suspended, like the day has not decided what it is going to become yet, and for a moment I just sat there with both hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the glass doors ahead of me, knowing that once I walked through them there would be no pretending anymore, no delaying, no telling myself it was just stress or exhaustion or anything else easier to believe. The waiting room was almost empty, just one older woman flipping through a magazine she was not really reading and a television mounted in the corner playing a morning show with the volume too low to follow, and I signed in with a name that felt unfamiliar in my own handwriting, like I was already becoming someone else, someone separate from the version of me that had stood in the rain listening to him walk away without looking back. When they called my name I followed the nurse down a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of disinfectant and something softer underneath, something clean and neutral, and I kept my eyes forward because looking at anything too closely felt like it might make everything too real too fast. The room was small, just a chair, a counter, a monitor that blinked quietly, and I sat when she told me to, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from shaking, answering questions in a voice that sounded calm even to me, like it belonged to someone who had already accepted whatever was coming next, and maybe that was true. Maybe some part of me had accepted it the second I pressed my hand against my stomach on that street corner and felt the shift in everything I thought I understood about my life. The minutes stretched in a way that made time feel unreliable, like it was moving both too fast and not at all, and when the doctor finally came in she smiled gently, the kind of smile that was practiced but not empty, and she spoke carefully, clearly, every word landing with a weight I could not ignore even if I tried, and I watched her lips move, listened to the confirmation I already knew was coming, and felt something inside me settle instead of break, something steady and quiet that did not panic, did not run, did not look back toward him for answers or permission or anything at all. "You are pregnant," she said, and the words did not echo, they did not shatter, they simply existed, solid and undeniable, and I nodded slowly like I had been expecting them, like I had been waiting for someone else to say it out loud so I would not have to be the one to admit it first. She kept talking about options, about timelines, about care and support and things that sounded important but distant, and I listened enough to understand but not enough to get lost in details, because my focus had narrowed again, not to escape this time but to hold on to it, to understand what this meant without letting fear rewrite it into something smaller than it was. When I stepped back outside the sky had shifted to a pale gray, the kind that promised sunlight later but not yet, and I stood there for a moment with the cool air brushing against my skin, feeling the difference between the girl who had walked in and the one standing here now, and it was not dramatic, not visible, nothing anyone else would notice, but it was absolute, because now there was something that depended on me, something that connected me to a future he was not part of, not unless I allowed it, and for the first time since that night I felt something that was not pain or confusion or loss, something quieter but stronger, something that did not ask for his approval or his presence, something that belonged entirely to me, and I realized with a clarity that almost took my breath away that whatever came next, whatever choices I made, whatever distance I put between us, he would not be the one deciding the outcome anymore, because he had already walked away from the one truth that mattered most, and he did not even know it. I did not go back to my apartment after that, not to the place where every surface still held traces of him, not to the silence that would feel too loud without his presence somewhere in it. Instead I drove in the opposite direction until the skyline began to thin and the buildings grew smaller, until the city that had once felt like his territory slowly turned into something that belonged to no one. And for the first time since I met him I understood what distance really meant, not just physical miles but something deeper, something that could not be undone with a phone call or a single command spoken in that low, controlled voice of his. I checked into a small extended-stay motel off a highway exit I had never noticed before, the kind of place where the carpet was worn and the air conditioning unit rattled every few minutes like it was trying to keep up with something it could not quite reach, and when the receptionist handed me the key card she barely looked at me, which was exactly what I needed: anonymity, space, a place where I was not connected to him in any visible way. The room was simple: a bed, a small table, a mirror that reflected a version of me I was still trying to understand, and I set my bag down slowly, taking in the quiet that felt different from the silence I had left behind. This one was not heavy, not expectant, it did not wait for footsteps that would never come, it just existed, steady and neutral, like a blank page I had not yet decided how to fill. I sat on the edge of the bed and let my hands rest in my lap again, feeling that same instinctive pull toward my stomach, not out of fear this time but something closer to awareness, like I was beginning to understand the weight of what had changed without needing anyone else to explain it to me, and for a moment I closed my eyes and let everything settle, the words he said, the look in his eyes, the finality of it, and instead of breaking me the way I thought it would, it began to separate from me, like it belonged to a version of my life that was already fading into the past. I reached for the small notebook in my bag, the one I used for grocery lists and reminders, and I opened it to a blank page, staring at it longer than necessary before writing anything at all, because this was not a list I had ever planned to make, not something I thought I would need, but now it felt necessary, grounding, something I could hold onto when everything else felt uncertain, and I wrote down the simplest things first: find a doctor, save money, stay somewhere safe, and then I paused. Pen hovering over the page as one more thought pushed its way forward: do not go back. The words looked small on paper, almost insignificant, but I knew they were not, because going back would not just be about me anymore, it would mean placing this fragile future into a world where control mattered more than care, where decisions were made without asking, where love could be erased with a single sentence and replaced with silence, and I could not risk that, not for myself and not for what I now carried. The sun had started to rise by then, faint light slipping through the thin curtains, soft and uncertain, and I stood up slowly, walking to the window and pulling the fabric aside just enough to let it in, watching as the parking lot shifted from shadows to something clearer, more defined, and I realized that this was what starting over looked like: not dramatic, not loud, just a series of quiet decisions that moved you further away from what you once thought you needed. Somewhere miles away, he was probably continuing his life exactly as before: meetings, calls, decisions that shaped entire outcomes without him ever needing to raise his voice, and the thought no longer made my chest tighten the way it had before, because for the first time I understood something that changed everything. He had all the power in the world when I was standing in front of him, but out here, away from his reach, away from his control, there was something he did not have, something he did not even know existed, and that made all the difference. The first morning felt almost unreal, like I had stepped into someone else's life without fully understanding how I got there, and I moved through it slowly, carefully, as if any sudden decision might pull me back into a reality I had just escaped, and that thought alone was enough to keep me focused, grounded, present in every small detail that did not involve him. I found a grocery store a few miles down the road, the kind with bright aisles and familiar brands that made everything feel ordinary in a way I desperately needed, and I walked through it with a basket in my hand, choosing things without overthinking them: bottled water, fruit, simple meals I could prepare without effort, because even something as basic as eating now felt different, felt intentional, like every choice mattered in a way it never had before. People passed me without a second glance, talking on their phones, comparing prices, living their lives without knowing mine had shifted overnight, and there was something comforting in that, something steady about being invisible again, about not being the center of attention in a world built on power and observation. Back in the room, I unpacked slowly, placing each item with care, organizing what little I had into something that felt like stability, and when I finally sat down again, I noticed the quiet had changed. It was no longer empty, it was purposeful, like it was giving me space to think instead of reminding me of what I had lost. I opened my phone out of habit, scrolling through messages that did not exist, and for a brief second I wondered if he had tried to reach me, if somewhere there was a missed call or a message waiting, something that would complicate the clean break I had forced myself to accept, but there was nothing, no trace, no attempt, and the absence felt heavier than any confrontation could have, because it confirmed what I had already begun to understand. He had already moved on in the only way he knew. How? By erasing what no longer served him. I set the phone down and leaned back against the headboard, letting out a slow breath, and that was when the reality settled deeper, not just that I was alone, but that I had chosen to be, and that choice came with responsibility I could not ignore, not now, not anymore. I reached for the notebook again, flipping to the page I had started, and added more lines beneath the first ones: find work, keep records, plan ahead, and then I paused, pressing the pen lightly against the paper as a different kind of thought surfaced, one that felt less practical and more personal. Protect this, and even as I wrote it I understood what it meant, not just physically, not just in the obvious ways, but emotionally, mentally, in every decision that would shape what came next. I could not afford to be uncertain anymore, could not afford to drift back into something familiar just because it was easier than building something new, because this time it was not just my life at stake, it was a future I had not expected but could not ignore. Outside, the sound of cars passing on the highway created a steady rhythm, constant and unchanging, and I found myself listening to it as if it were proof that the world kept moving no matter what happened inside it, no matter who walked away or who stayed behind, and for the first time since that night, the thought did not feel overwhelming, it felt grounding, like a reminder that I could move forward too, step by step, decision by decision, without needing his permission or his presence to define the direction. Somewhere, far from here, he was still living in a world built on control and certainty, a world where outcomes were calculated and emotions were kept at a distance, and for so long I had believed that being close to that kind of power meant safety, meant stability, but now I saw it differently. Now I understood that real strength was quieter, less visible, something that grew in moments like this when no one was watching, when no one was guiding you, when the only voice you could rely on was your own. And as I rested my hand lightly against my stomach again, feeling that same quiet awareness, I realized that whatever came next, whatever challenges waited ahead, I was not walking into them empty-handed, because I was carrying something he could not control, something he could not take back, something he did not even know existed, and that changed everything. By the third day, I stopped checking the door every time a car slowed down outside, stopped holding my breath at the sound of footsteps passing too close to my room, and that alone told me how much of my life had been shaped by anticipation, by waiting for something or someone to enter without warning, to change everything in a single moment. And now that nothing came, now that the silence stayed steady and predictable, I began to understand just how loud that kind of control had been even when it looked like calm. I found a small diner across the street that opened at 6 in the morning, the kind of place where the coffee was strong and the regulars sat in the same booths every day, and I started going there without thinking too much about it, ordering the same breakfast, sitting by the window, letting routine build something that felt almost like stability, and the waitress, a woman in her late 50s with tired eyes and a soft voice, began to recognize me by the second visit, calling me honey without asking my name, refilling my cup before I realized it was empty, and it was such a simple thing, such a small kindness, but it grounded me in a way I had not expected. I kept my answers short when she asked where I was from, where I was headed, because I did not have a story that felt safe to tell yet, not one that did not circle back to him in some way, and that was something I was still learning how to separate, how to untangle my identity from a world that had defined me so quickly and so completely. Back in the room, I began searching for work, scrolling through listings on my phone, applying to anything that felt manageable, anything that would not require questions I was not ready to answer, and it felt strange at first, going back to something so ordinary after everything I had experienced, like stepping out of a storm into a quiet room and not trusting that the walls would hold, but with each application sent, each small step forward, the feeling shifted from unfamiliar to necessary. In the afternoons, I walked, not far, just enough to clear my head, tracing the same path along the side of the road where a narrow strip of grass separated traffic from the sidewalk, watching people move through their routines, carrying groceries, talking on phones, living lives that did not revolve around power or control, and I realized how much I had forgotten what that looked like, how normal had once felt before it became something distant and almost unreal. At night, the quiet returned, but it no longer pressed against me the way it had before. It settled around me instead, like a space I could fill with my own thoughts, my own decisions, and sometimes those thoughts drifted back to him, not with longing exactly, but with a kind of detached awareness, remembering the way he moved through a room, the way people reacted without him needing to say a word, and I wondered if he had noticed my absence yet, if there had been a moment, even a brief one, where he looked around and realized something was missing, but the thought did not hold me the way it once would have. It passed through, leaving behind something quieter, something more certain. I placed my hand against my stomach again, a habit now, a reminder more than a question, and I stood there for a long moment, feeling the stillness, the absence of anything obvious, and yet the presence of everything that mattered, and it struck me then that this was the first time in my life I was building something that did not depend on anyone else's approval, something that existed because I chose it, protected it, carried it forward one day at a time. Somewhere far away, he was still making decisions that shaped outcomes, still controlling pieces of a world I had stepped out of, and maybe he had not thought of me again, maybe I was already nothing more than a closed chapter in a life that did not allow for loose ends, but that no longer felt like something I needed to question, because for the first time, the direction of my life was not tied to his choices, and whether he knew it or not, there was now a future unfolding that he could not see, could not predict, and could not control, and that quiet truth stayed with me as the night settled in, steady and unshaken. It happened on a Thursday morning, the kind that felt exactly like the one before it and the one before that, predictable in a way I had started to rely on, and I was sitting in the same booth by the window with a cup of coffee cooling between my hands when the television above the counter shifted from a local weather report to something else, something that made the air in the room change in a way I could not immediately explain. I was not even looking at the screen at first, just listening to the low murmur of voices blending into the background, until a name cut through it, clear and unmistakable, and everything inside me went still before I could stop it. Victor Hale. The sound of it felt different now, distant but sharp, like something I had packed away too quickly and was not ready to hear again, and I told myself not to look, told myself it did not matter, that whatever he was doing, wherever he was, had nothing to do with me anymore, but my eyes moved anyway, drawn by something I could not control. The image on the screen was familiar, him standing in a perfectly tailored suit, expression calm, composed, surrounded by people who looked to him before speaking, and for a second it felt like I was right back there, like nothing had changed, like I had never left, but then the camera angle shifted and I saw it, not in his posture, not in his voice, but in something smaller, something most people would never notice. The way his gaze paused for just a fraction too long before answering a question, the way his hand tightened slightly against the edge of the table as if grounding himself, and it struck me then that even someone like him could not completely hide everything. The reporter was talking about a business deal, something large, something that would reshape an entire district, and he answered with the same precision he always had, measured, controlled, every word placed exactly where it needed to be, and yet there was something missing, something I could not name but felt clearly, like a silence beneath the surface that did not belong there. I looked away before the segment ended, forcing my attention back to the table, to the chipped edge of the mug, to the steady rhythm of the diner around me, but it was too late, the moment had already settled in my chest, not as longing, not as regret, but as a realization I had not expected. He had not come looking for me. Not in any way that mattered. Not in a way that would reach this place, this quiet corner of the world where I had chosen to disappear, and for the first time since I left, the truth of that did not hurt the way I thought it would. It clarified something instead, something that made my next breath feel steadier, more certain. The waitress came by and asked if I wanted a refill, and I nodded, my voice calm when I thanked her, like nothing had shifted inside me at all, and maybe that was the most surprising part, not that I had seen him again, not that his name still carried weight, but that it no longer controlled the direction of my thoughts the way it once had. I finished my coffee slowly, taking my time before stepping back out into the same morning light that had begun to feel familiar, and as I crossed the parking lot I placed my hand lightly against my stomach again, the gesture now instinctive, grounding, and I realized that whatever world he was still building, whatever deals he was still closing, it was moving further away from mine with each passing day. Somewhere behind me, his voice continued through the television, shaping narratives, influencing outcomes, but out here, in this quiet stretch of road and routine, there was something else taking shape, something quieter but no less powerful, something he had not accounted for, something he did not even know existed, and as I opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat, I understood with a clarity that settled deep and unshaken. He might still control everything he could see, but there was now a future growing just beyond his reach, and it was already beginning to change everything. The call came later that afternoon, just as I was folding a stack of freshly washed clothes on the small table near the window, the kind of quiet, ordinary moment that had started to feel like something I could depend on, and for a second I almost did not answer it, because the number was unfamiliar and I had already learned that unfamiliar usually meant complicated, but something in me hesitated just long enough to pick up, to press the phone to my ear and say hello in a voice that stayed steady even as my instincts sharpened. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, measured in a way that immediately put me on alert without explaining why, and he asked for me by name, full name, not the shortened version I had been using lately, not the version I gave at the motel or the diner, and that alone was enough to make my grip tighten slightly around the phone. I did not confirm right away, I let a second pass, then another, before answering carefully, asking who was calling, and there was a pause on the other end, brief but noticeable, like the person had expected compliance, not caution. He introduced himself as someone from a financial office, vague enough to sound legitimate but not specific enough to settle the unease building in my chest, and he mentioned a document, something that required my attention, something connected to a previous account, and the words felt rehearsed, precise, like they had been chosen to reveal just enough without saying anything that could be questioned too directly. I listened without interrupting, my mind moving faster than my voice, connecting details, weighing possibilities, and then he said it, not a name, not directly, but something close enough that it landed with quiet certainty, referencing a transaction that only one person would know about, something tied to a world I had deliberately stepped away from, something that should not have reached me here unless someone had gone looking. I felt the shift instantly, not panic, not fear, something colder, sharper, a realization settling into place with uncomfortable clarity, because this was not random, this was not coincidence, this was a thread that had followed me further than I thought possible. I ended the call shortly after, offering nothing, confirming nothing, my voice polite but distant, and when the line went silent I stood there for a long moment with the phone still in my hand, the room around me unchanged but somehow no longer as contained as it had been before. I moved to the window slowly, pulling the curtain aside just enough to look out at the parking lot below. Half expecting to see something different, something out of place, but everything looked the same, cars parked in uneven lines, sunlight stretching across the pavement, nothing that suggested I had been found, and yet the feeling remained, steady and undeniable, like a door had been opened somewhere I could not see. I placed my hand against my stomach again, instinctively, grounding myself in the one truth that mattered, and I took a slow breath, forcing my thoughts to settle into something usable, something clear, because if there was even a chance that my location was no longer completely hidden, then I could not stay still, I could not assume that distance alone would be enough to protect what I had chosen to keep safe. I turned back into the room and reached for my bag, pulling out the notebook, flipping to the page where I had written my plan, and for the first time since I started it, I added a new line at the bottom, leave before they know for sure, and as the ink settled into the paper, so did the decision, quiet but absolute. Somewhere, miles away, he might still be unaware of what truly connected us now, might still believe that what we had ended the moment he said those words, but something in his world had shifted just enough to reach mine, just enough to remind me that his influence did not disappear simply because I walked away. And as I zipped my bag and looked around the small room that had started to feel temporary but safe, I understood that safety was not something I could assume anymore, it was something I had to create, protect, and sometimes leave behind before it was taken from me, and whatever came next, whatever distance I had to put between us again, I would not wait to find out how close he really was, because this time, it was not just my life I was carrying, it was a future he could not be allowed to claim. I left before sunrise, not because I was certain someone would come, but because I had learned that waiting for certainty was a risk I could not afford anymore, and the room that had felt safe the night before now felt temporary again, like it had already served its purpose and was asking me to move on before it became something else entirely. I packed quickly, folding what little I had with practiced efficiency, leaving nothing behind that could trace me back, and when I stepped outside the air was cool, quiet, the kind of stillness that makes every small sound feel louder than it should, the click of the car door, the soft crunch of gravel under my shoes, the steady rhythm of my own breathing as I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine without hesitation. I did not look back at the building, not even once, because I knew if I did, I might start thinking about how close I had come to feeling settled, how easily I had almost believed that distance alone could protect me, and that kind of thinking was dangerous now. It left space for mistakes, for hesitation, for the kind of second-guessing that could cost more than I was willing to risk. The road stretched ahead of me in long, empty lines, the horizon just beginning to lighten with the promise of a new day, and I drove without a fixed destination at first, letting instinct guide me away from what I knew and towards something unknown but necessary, something that could not be predicted or easily followed. Hours passed like that, the steady hum of the engine becoming a constant backdrop to my thoughts, and somewhere along the way the tension in my shoulders eased just slightly, not because I believed I was completely out of reach, but because I was moving, because I was choosing direction instead of waiting for it to be decided for me. I stopped once at a gas station off a rural exit, the kind of place where no one asked questions and no one looked twice at a stranger passing through, and as I stood there filling the tank, I caught my reflection in the window again, the same face, the same eyes, but something in them had shifted, something steadier, something that did not look back expecting to see him standing there anymore. Inside, I bought a bottle of water and a map, not because I needed one in a practical sense, but because it felt grounding to hold something physical, something that represented choice, direction, possibility, and I spread it out on the hood of the car for a moment, tracing routes with my finger. Not looking for the fastest path, not looking for the easiest one, just choosing somewhere that felt far enough to start over again. When I got back behind the wheel, I placed my hand against my stomach once more, the gesture now as natural as breathing, and I let myself feel the weight of what I was doing, not just leaving, not just running, but building something new from nothing, something that did not depend on his world or his rules or his decisions, something that existed entirely because I chose to protect it. Somewhere, in a place I could no longer see, he might still be searching for answers he did not yet understand, might be following threads that had not fully led him here, and maybe one day he would realize what he had walked away from, what he had dismissed with a single sentence, but that realization would come too late to change this moment, too late to shape what I was creating now. The road ahead remained open, uncertain, filled with questions I did not yet have answers for, but for the first time, that uncertainty did not feel like something to fear, it felt like something I owned, something I could shape one decision at a time, and as the sun finally broke over the horizon, casting light across the empty stretch of highway in front of me, I understood something with a clarity that settled deep and unshaken. He had believed he ended my story the moment he let me go, but he had never imagined that I would be the one to decide how it truly began.